Philip Randolph was a giant of the American labor movement and the civil rights movement in the 20th century. He understood that the labor movement would never be able to reach its full potential so long as it excluded Black workers on a mass level, which it historically had. And he saw that Black workers would be continually marginalized so long as they were left to fight on their own. They would continue to be denied basic economic, political, and social rights. The best way that he put this was that Black workers are second-class citizens because while the Civil War emancipated them from the chains of chattel slavery, it never transformed them into free workers in the labor market or free citizens in public life. And he devoted his life to changing that. He was born in northern Florida in 1889 to parents who instilled racial pride in him, and he kept that with him as a young man and for the rest of his life. He left Florida at the age of 22 because he realized that the strict boundaries of Jim Crow would never allow him to grow beyond a manual laborer and would never support his intellectual curiosities. So he went to New York City in 1911 and moved to Harlem, which was already becoming the Black capital of the world, and certainly of the United States. Initially, he planned to be a Shakespearean actor, but that didn't work out. And so he turned to activism. He discovered socialism, and he discovered labor rights and labor organizing. And he began doing that very soon after he arrived, organizing Black workers in New York City. Randolph spent the 19-teens and the early 1920s organizing locally in New York City. In 1925, the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, a new labor union representing Black workers, asked Randolph to be its first president, and he agreed. This would prove to give Randolph much more experience and a national profile over the coming years. Now, Randolph was not a sleeping car porter, and that was the point. The men asked him because he was external to the company. He could not be intimidated, he could not be fired, he could not be blacklisted, unlike these workers. At this time and in the 1930s, if you wanted to travel a long distance in this country, rail was really your only option. We would not have a good highway system until the 1950s. And traveling long distances, these trains essentially became hotels on wheels. And no one made more luxurious rail cars than the Pullman Company. This was the same Pullman Company that had destroyed the American Railway Union in the 1890s. And they were no less anti-union by the 1920s, even though their founder, George Pullman, was long since dead. The men wanted things that would not be surprising. They wanted better pay, shorter hours, better working conditions, and they wanted respect. And that may have been the most important part, because these men were degraded constantly on the train. They waited on wealthy white passengers hand and foot at all hours of the day, tending to their every need. And Pullman, the company, insisted upon only hiring Black workers to replicate that servitude relationship between Black and white. And in fact, all of these Pullman porters were expected to answer to George, again, the name of the founder of the company, effectively losing their first names while they were at work. Randolph took on this job and he knew it would not be an easy one. They struggled for years. Pullman intimidated them, used violence, tried to replace them, but they kept at it. And finally, with the advent of pro-labor legislation during the Roosevelt years and the New Deal, they were finally able to gain recognition, first from the AFL, who granted them an international charter in 1935. And then finally, in 1937, Pullman recognized the union, and they negotiated their first contract with the company, which resulted in significant wage gains and improvements on the job. Randolph, by the 1940s, was the most prominent Black labor leader in the United States. After all, he was the head of a labor union that was an AFL affiliate. He decided to take his activism to a new level. By 1940, the United States was already transitioning to a war economy. Now, we weren't involved in fighting yet, But we were heavily supplying our allies, and it seemed clear that we would get directly involved sooner rather than later. Randolph took aim at two things: the segregated military, which had been official policy really always, and the fact that defense industries excluded Black workers almost entirely. Defense jobs were good jobs, they tended to be union jobs, and they were becoming more and more plentiful as the war progressed and spread. Randolph and his allies, including the NAACP, had tried convincing the Roosevelt administration to do something about this, and they refused. Randolph grew frustrated and decided that he would establish a protest movement, the goal of which would be bringing 100,000 African Americans to Washington, D.C., July 1st, 1941, to pressure the Roosevelt administration to take action on these two items. And they were serious. In January of 1941, Randolph established the March on Washington movement, and they began organizing and holding rallies all around the country. And this was not as difficult as it might seem, because wherever you had a local of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, it was a pretty good bet that there'd be a March on Washington movement chapter there pretty soon. And they drew big numbers. They filled Madison Square Garden. And so as the winter turned to the spring, their numbers grew, their planning continued, and the Roosevelt administration grew more desperate to pressure Randolph to call it off. But he was utterly determined to make this change. And so finally, with the march only 1 week away, Roosevelt signed an executive order that barred discrimination in hiring and defense contracting. He didn't touch segregation in the military, which would not change until Truman in 1948. Nonetheless, Randolph won. Following the success of the March on Washington movement, Randolph continued to fight for equality and opportunity for Black workers and Black people. In 1955, he became a vice president of the newly merged AFL-CIO. His main mission in that position was to drive out white supremacy, as not only was discrimination still common, but there were still several unions that had white-only clauses in their constitutions. In 1963, Randolph finally saw his March on Washington take place. This was the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. And you see a photograph here of many of the major figures. You see Randolph seated second from the right next to Dr. King. You'd have a young John Lewis above Randolph. And to the far right, standing, you have Walter Reuther, United Auto Workers president. Though Reuther and Randolph were both there, the AFL-CIO refused to endorse it. George Meany in particular, the head of the AFL-CIO, wouldn't do it. Instead, it released a statement in support, and Reuther said that that statement was so weak that it needed a blood transfusion on the way to the copy machine. Nonetheless, this represents the high watermark of the interracial civil rights movement, and organized labor was a big part of it. Here, we see the grandest demonstration of Randolph's vision of merging labor rights and civil rights. The following year, Randolph would be awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom, and here you see President Lyndon Johnson giving that to him. Randolph continued his struggle for labor rights and civil rights for the rest of his life, and this was a man who really walked the walk, as we say. In the 1960s, he left Harlem and moved down to Chelsea, where he would live for the rest of his life in an apartment complex that was union sponsored. Randolph died in 1979, having left a legacy of enormous contributions to labor rights and civil rights.